My Brother Sam is Dead, Chapter 10. Having father gone was strange. The tavern seemed cold and empty, the way it is when you wake up at night and realize that the fires have gone out. Mother didn't cry, except right at the beginning, the night I told her what had happened. She went on believing that he was alive. They had no reason to kill him, Timothy. I believe they're hiding him somewhere. They'll let him go by and by. But the days passed and he didn't come home. And soon she changed her story. He's in a prison ship somewhere, she said. As soon as this terrible war is over, he'll come home again. I didn't know whether she was saying what she believed or was just trying to keep me from thinking that my father was dead. Now half the family was gone and our lives were really changed. Mother and I had all the work to do, which meant that there was hardly any time off for either of us. We even had to work on Sunday, which was a sin. God will forgive us, Tim, Mother said. Don't worry about it, I'm sure of that. I didn't tell her that I wasn't worried. But the work worried me, all right. There was so much to do. Old Prue and the chickens and sheep to take care of, and the spring, planting the corn and greens we needed for the tavern, and the cleaning and the cooking. And of course, somebody had to be at the tap all the time to draw beer and serve the meals to travelers and make up beds for people who came through needing a place to sleep. There were a lot of people going through, too. Messengers going here and there, and people moving to different towns, and commissary officers and such. So business seemed good, but actually it wasn't, because a lot of people, the ones on official business, paid in commissary notes, which were just pieces of paper that wouldn't be worth anything at all unless the rebels won. You couldn't buy very much with commissary notes. A lot of people wouldn't take them unless they were strong patriots and felt they ought to in order to show their faith in George Washington and the rebel government. Business was good for the store, too. Food was in short supply, and so was everything else. And we could sell anything we could get our hands on. Cloth, farming tools, wheat, sugar, rum, anything at all. We even started dealing in used goods. Farmers were desperate for everything. Shovels, plowshares, candle molds, churns, and all the rest of it. Sometimes Mother would hear of a widow whose husband had died or had been killed in the war and couldn't manage the farm anymore. She'd be willing to sell us the old farming tools, and we could easily resell them at a good price. But even that didn't help much. Prices kept going up, and depreciation of the paper money took a lot of the profit out of it. You'd sell a bag of nails for $1, and when you went out to buy some more, you'd find that the price had gone up to $2. So you came out behind. We'd raise the price of nails, and then by the time we were able to get hold of any more, the price would have gone up again, and we'd still be behind. Of course, you weren't supposed to raise prices. The Connecticut General Assembly had made laws about how much you could charge for things, but the laws weren't any use. If you had to pay 2 shillings for nails, you couldn't sell them for 2 shillings, no matter what the law said. What we did to get around the law, we charged the legal 2 shillings for the nails, or whatever it was, and then charged a shilling more for the bag we sold them in. It wasn't really honest, but we didn't have any choice. The whole thing really made me feel pretty sick, working that hard from sunrise to sunset, never being able to get ahead. But there was nothing we could do about it except to pray every night that the war would end soon and Father and Sam would come home again. We spent a lot of time trying to get letters to Sam. Mother figured that once Sam realized that his own side had captured or maybe even killed his father, he'd come home and help manage things. He should be tired of playing soldier by now, Mother said. I should think that glory would have worn off. She had to talk with Colonel Reed about it. Colonel Reed had been head of a whole regiment of militia, but he'd quit the job. He said it was because he was too old, but everybody knew that was just an excuse. He'd quit because he was against the war and didn't want to fight in it. He was a patriot, but he didn't approve of the war. He said to my mother, Mrs. Meeker, even if you can persuade him to come home, they may not let him. Well, that doesn't seem right. Well, of course, Sam could claim it was a hardship case, his father gone, and only the younger brother left at home. But the fact that Mr. Meeker is considered a Tory won't help. Mother said, if he's got the brains he was born with, he won't tell them that, will he, Colonel Reed? Colonel Reed smiled. I don't imagine he will, Mrs. Meeker. But I wasn't so sure anybody was going to be able to change Sam's mind to begin with. He'd got himself set to win the war and throw the British out of the country so we could be free. And when Sam was determined, he usually stuck to things. Pig-headed was what some people called him, but not me. Of course, I still hadn't figured out what he was fighting for. It seemed to me that we'd been free all along. What had the English government ever done against me? I thought about that a lot, and I never could find any way they'd hurt us that had mattered very much. Naturally, in church, we had to pray for the king and parliament, and that was a nuisance because it made the prayers go on longer. As a matter of fact, we weren't supposed to pray for the king and parliament anymore. The assembly had declared that it was treason to pray for them. But Mr. Beach was pretty brave, even though he was over 75 years old, and he went on praying for them anyway. A couple of times, rebels had come into the church and pulled him down from the pulpit and pushed him around, but he didn't care. He made us pray for the king and parliament just the same. Still, besides having extra prayers, I couldn't think of anything that the king had made me do that I didn't want to. But that wasn't the way Sam felt about it, and I wasn't exactly sure he'd come home even when he finally found out Father was gone. There was only one way to find out, so we kept trying to get messages to him. We asked Betsy Reed to tell him about Father if she got in touch with him, but she didn't know where he was any more than we did. So there were a lot of changes in our lives, but the biggest was the one that was happening inside myself. Ever since I got the wagon home by myself, I hadn't felt like a boy anymore. You don't think that things really happen overnight, but this one did. Of course, I was dead tired when I went to bed that night, and Mother let me sleep late in the morning. And when I woke up, I was different. I noticed it first at breakfast. Usually I sat there over my porridge moaning to myself about the chores I had to do or having to go to school or something, and trying to think of some way to get out of whatever it was. Or when Mother turned her head, I'd scoop up a fingerful of molasses from the jar and stir it into my milk, or I'd eat breakfast slowly so I could stall off going to work. But that morning, after the terrible trip home, right from the first moment we got finished saying grace, I began planning the things I had to do, which things had to be done first, and what was the best way to get them done. It was funny. It didn't even cross my mind to stall or try to get out of the work. I didn't wait for Mother to tell me what to do. I brought the subject up myself. I've got to get the wagon unloaded right away, I told her. Everything will get damp sitting out there in the barn. Maybe I can get Jerry Sanford to help me roll the barrels down. Mother nodded. I think she must have been surprised to hear me talk like that, but she didn't let on. You'll need somebody bigger than Jerry. Perhaps you should hire Sam Smith's Negro, Ned. We discussed it all. And about halfway through breakfast, I began to realize that I had changed. I wasn't acting my usual self. I was acting more like a grown-up. You couldn't say that I was really an adult, but I wasn't a child anymore. That was certain. I thought about showing off in front of Sam when he came home. I'd say things like, "Well, Sam, we've decided not to put in oats this year. We're going to use the space for corn." Or, "We're not keeping the kitchen fire going all the time. I haven't got enough time for wood cutting as it is." I would be the one who knew about things, not him. But even though it was nice to feel more grown up and act that way too, I missed Father. Especially toward the end of the day when I was tired and cold and hungry, and there was still wood to be brought up, and the barn to be cleaned, and old Prue to be milked. I'd begin feeling sorry for myself and wishing that Father was back. I'd imagine that if I looked up, I'd suddenly see him striding into the barnyard, and I'd look up, but he wouldn't be there. I'd stand there feeling disappointed, even though I'd really known he wouldn't be there, and I'd get angry with the rebels for starting the war, and angry with Sam for going to play soldier and have the glory while I had to do all the work at home. It wasn't fair. It would make me curse, and I didn't care whether cursing was a sin. Winter came and winter went, and the war went on in the same distant way. Oh, the effects of it were real, the rising prices, the shortage of everything, the news that so-and-so had been killed in some faraway battle. But all the things you think of as belonging to a war, the battles and cannons firing and marching troops and dead and wounded, we hadn't seen any of it, except for the messengers and commissary officers who came by. It got to be spring 1777. The work went on, except that instead of cutting wood, cleaning the barn, and pitching hay for the animals, I now spent my day digging and planting in our garden by the side of the house so we'd have fresh vegetables for the tavern. And I was doing this one Saturday morning, early toward the end of April, the 26th to be exact, when I began hearing from a long way away a heavy muttering noise. It sounded a bit like thunder, but not exactly. It made me uneasy. I jammed the spade into the ground and went out in front of the tavern to have a look up and down the road. The sound seemed to be coming from the southwest, over behind the church somewhere, but there wasn't anything to be seen. And then I saw Ned, Samuel Smith's Negro, coming running up the road. At the same moment, Captain Betts popped out of his house next door. Captain Betts was in the rebel militia. "What is it, Ned?" he shouted. "British troops," Captain Ned shouted. He ran on by. Captain Betts turned back in the doorway. "Jerry," he shouted, "quick, get Mr. Rogers here." Jerry Sanford dashed past him through the door and up the road toward the Rogers. Captain Betts continued to stand there for a moment more, listening. "What do you think they're doing, Captain Betts?" I called. He looked grim. "It won't be anything good. There are a lot of them." "Is the militia going to try to stop them?" He scowled. "There aren't enough patriots in Reading to stop a pair of cows going through." Then he went back into the house. I turned and went into the tavern. Mother was scouring some pots. "British troops coming," I told her. "What do you think they'll do?" "Drink and not pay for it," she said. "That's the rule with soldiers. Take the good pewter out to the barn and hide it in the hay." I did it, and then I came back round to the front to watch the soldiers come. Now I could see a fine shading of dust in the air, out behind the church, rising slowly and drifting away. The noise grew louder. I watched, and all at once through the hedgerows, I caught a glimpse of movement and things flashing. In a moment, the vanguard appeared around the bend. There was a drummer boy banging away in front and a standard bearer, and then a couple of officers on horseback, and then the marching men. On down the road toward me they came. It was a frightening thing to see. They just kept coming on and on as if nothing in the world could stop them. Now I could see cannons, each of them about 12 feet long and drawn by 2 horses. I figured they must be 6-pounders from what I'd read about it. Behind them were wagons full of boxes and bags, powder and balls and such, I figured. The dust rose up through everything, turning the red uniforms, the cannons, the wagons, all a grayish brown. They marched past the tavern, pulled off onto the training ground, and broke formation. Mr. Rogers ran by with Jerry Sanford coming behind him as fast as they could. They dashed into Captain Betts's house. I hoped they weren't trying to get the train band organized to fight the British. That was impossible. There were hundreds of redcoats milling about around on the training ground, maybe thousands even. Most of the people in the village were standing in their yards watching. The children kept dashing up the road to the training ground to get a closer look, until their mothers saw them and dragged them back home again. In the training ground, the soldiers were settling down to eat breakfast, dumping their packs on the ground and stacking their muskets into neat little teepees, 4 or 5 together. I kept hoping that some officers would come into the tavern for rum or beer or something to eat. I wanted to see them up close and listen to them talk. Oh, those troops were impressive looking, with all those belts and buckles and powder horns and bayonets and so forth dangling out about their red uniforms. How could people like Sam expect to beat them? But the officers didn't come into the tavern. Instead, 3 or 4 of them rode up to Mr. Heron's house. I saw Mr. Heron open the door to let them in, and they disappeared. I guessed that Mr. Heron had known in advance that they were coming. Probably he had set out a big breakfast for them. It gave me a funny feeling to realize that while Mr. Heron was giving the British officers rum and beef, Captain Betts and Mr. Rogers were sitting inside the Betts house 100 yards away trying to figure out a way to kill them. I went on watching. Some of the bigger children had got away from their mothers and were standing at the edge of the training ground, looking at the soldiers. After a while, the children began shouting questions at the men, like had they ever killed anybody, and weren't they afraid of the rebels and so forth? The soldiers joked back with the kids, and after a while, I walked over myself and listened. "Where are you headed for?" I asked for one of the redcoats. "If I knew, I wouldn't tell you." He had a funny accent. "Where are you from?" I asked. "Where are you from, lad?" "Right there," I pointed to the tavern. "Well, I'm from old Dublin," he said, "and I wished I was back there right now instead of marching through this bloomin' place." "What's Ireland like?" "Oh, it is a lovely place, all green and cool and like, if you don't mind a spot of rain. How is it you're not afraid of us, you tykes?" "We're mostly Tories here." Suddenly I realized that I was. Father's capture had done that. "Ah," he said. And I would have talked with him some more, but then, just then, an officer came riding and shouted, "Get along, you bloody Yankee scum, get back to your mothers." He slapped his quirt on his leg, and we all ran. I stood in our yard watching. The officer shouted something to the soldiers. There was a scurrying around, and then 8 of them snatched up their guns, formed into 2s, and marched out behind the officer. He wheeled his horse about and trotted toward me. I jumped back and plunged for the tavern doorway. He galloped across our yard into the Betts yard, pulled the horse up, and shouted some more orders. The soldiers charged for the Betts' door, bashed it open with the butt ends of their rifles, and slammed into the house. 5 minutes later, they came out again, pushing in front of them Captain Betts, Mr. Rogers, and Jerry Sanford. Jerry was dead white. He was trying not to cry, but the tears were squeezing out of his eyes. When he kept wiping his face with his sleeve. The soldiers pushed the three of them onto the road, tied their hands behind their backs, and marched them onto the training ground through the troops. I knew now what the officer has gone up to Mr. Herons for. It wasn't for breakfast. It was to find out who the rebel leaders were. Now my mother was standing in the doorway beside me. "The brutes," she said. "What do they want with the little one? Can they think he's dangerous? What are they going to do with him, Mother?" "God have mercy on them," she said. "God have mercy on William Heron. They wouldn't shoot Jerry, would they?" "War turns men into beasts. It's cheaper to shoot a boy than to feed him." "I don't think they would, Mother. I don't think they'd shoot Jerry." It seemed unbelievable, but it made me go cold all the same. She shrugged. "Maybe not. Only the Lord knows about that. Come into the house before they take a fancy to you. Who knows what Mr. Herons told them about your brother?" "I'm all right, Mother. Come into the house, Timothy. I've lost two. I'm not losing another." I went in. I was full of all kinds of funny feelings. At first, when the troops had arrived, swaggering around so bold and gay, I had really admired them. But seeing them take Jerry Sanford off like that gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. I didn't think they'd shoot him. I figured they'd just taken him away because he lived with Captain Betts and happened to be there when the soldiers had come. But still, maybe they would shoot him. Maybe they'd want to torture him for secrets or something. After all, he lived with one of the rebel leaders and might know what their plans were or whether they had ammunition stored somewhere. I stood at the window watching. Mother told me to get away from the window and go about my work, but I didn't. I stayed there. Finally, about half an hour later, the officers mounted their horses and began riding the troops, shouting orders. Within a couple of minutes, the soldiers were formed up in the training ground, ready to march. And just as they were about to start off, there came the sound of a horse galloping. I dashed outside in time to see a horseman come over the rise of the road from the direction of Danbury. He was dressed in ordinary clothes, and I guessed that he was a rebel messenger. Suddenly, he spotted the British troops formed up on the training ground. He reined up and wheeled his horse around. Bending low, he kicked his heels into the horse and started to tear off back the way he'd come. There was a commotion in the British ranks and a quick fusillade of shots. The man suddenly straightened up in the middle and flung in the saddle and flung his arms out. His head jerked backward, and he slid off the back of the horse and lay still in the dusty road. A British officer shouted, and the troops marched out. The rider's horse was cantering off in a field, bucking. The troops marched past the body. None of them turned to look at him. Finally, the last of the wagons disappeared around the bend, and I started running down the road toward the body, scared of what I might see. Other people came running up too. The man was lying on his stomach with his face turned sideways. There was a tear in his shirt in the center of his back, and blood was soaking through the cloth, but sweat was running off his pale face, and he was breathing hard. "Pick him up and carry him to the tavern," Mr. Reed said. "Meeker, go up to Dr. Hobart's house and tell him we've got a wounded man down here." It was over 2 miles up to Dr. Hobart's. For a moment I thought about saddling up a horse, but the British troops were marching ahead of me in the direction of Dr. Hobart's, and I was afraid that if I came galloping by on a horse, they'd take me for a messenger and shoot me too. On foot, I could cut through the fields if I had to. I began running. Within 5 minutes, I ran into a dusty haze kicked up by the troops, and I realized that they must be just ahead of me. I jumped to the side of the road, swung over the stone wall, and cut across the pasture to the next stone wall, which was bordered by a line of trees. I slid over this wall and began running along it parallel to the road. I figured out I would run past the British troops and come out ahead of them before they reached Dr. Hobart's house. It would take some running, though. The British column was a mile long. I ran on, stumbling through the pasture stubble and furrows of the plowed fields. And I had covered almost 2 miles when I heard shots. At first, only 1 or 2, but then a fusillade. I dropped flat behind the stone wall and then raised my head to stare around. I couldn't see anything but the empty field that lay between me and the road. I slid over the stone wall and began to run, crouched over toward the stone wall at the other side of the field, which bordered the road. When I got to the wall, I flung myself flat and listened. The shooting was going on down the road away. I took a chance and raised my head to look over the wall. The British column was disappearing around the bend, but a couple of dozen troops had stayed behind. They were kneeling on the road in a line, firing at Captain Starr's house across the road from them, on the other side from where I lay. From where I was hidden behind the stone wall, I could look through the downstairs windows inside of the house. There were rebels in there, firing back at the Redcoats. The way I figured it, the rebels had hidden there and begun shooting at the British troops as they marched by. Through the windows, I could see the rebels moving around. I couldn't recognize all of them, but I knew some. One was Captain Starr. Another was Samuel Smith's Negro slave, Ned, the same one who'd first come running to report that the British were coming. As I watched, one of the British pitched over flat on the road. The rest went on firing into the building as if the bullets coming out at them didn't matter. It was the way the British fought. Suddenly, an officer shouted an order. The British troops rose, their bayonets flashing at the ends of their muskets. The officer raised his sword and charged toward the house, and troops ran after him. When they reached the door, the officer stood aside, and while the soldiers battered the door with their muskets. Suddenly it crashed open and the troops charged in. I heard somebody shout, "There's some damned blacks in here. What shall we do with them?" "Kill them," the officer yelled. He charged through the door, waving his sword. I could see Ned swivel away from the window where he crouched, attempting to swing his rifle around to get in and shot at the officer. But the officer was quicker. He slid his sword into Ned's stomach and then jerked it free. Ned staggered around, still raising his gun up for the shot. The sword flashed in a bright arc, the fastest thing I had ever seen move. Ned's head jumped off his body and popped into the air. I never saw it fall. I dropped down behind the stone wall and vomited all over myself. Then I got up and ran across the field and fell over the other stone wall. I lay there smelling my vomit and seeing Ned's head jump into the air. It was a long time before I realized that I was soaked with cold sweat and crying. I knelt up and listened. The shooting had stopped. I remembered the man in the tavern. He was dying too, and I didn't want to have his death laid on me. I slipped along the hedgerow, and when I was well past Starr's house, I came up to the field and back onto the road. For a moment, I looked. In the distance, I could see the British troops milling around the house. They were carrying heavy objects into the house. I knew what they were, but I didn't want to think about it. When the British had all the things in the house, they set the house on fire. I turned and ran down the road toward Dr. Hobart's. I didn't feel much like being a Tory anymore.